With a strong passion for the S-shaped country's history, culture, and architecture, a British historian has spent 20 years living, working, and hitching his life to Vietnam. He connects and preserves, in his own way, then and now, memories of Vietnamese regions.
My name is Tim Doling. I come from Bristol in the UK, which is an old port city. When I was a student, I studied history. Well, I first came to Vietnam back in 1989 when I was living in Hong Kong, and I actually came here as a tourist. So it's quite an interesting time to be here. I came back to Vietnam with my wife in 2010, and when I came back, of course, my original interest in history was revived.
To connoisseurs of ancient architecture in Ho Chi Minh City, Tim Doling is a familiar name. He's one of the foreign residents in Vietnam with in-depth historical understanding of almost every street corner and building of different periods in the city. All the discoveries he's got come from his great love towards Ho Chi Minh City and Vietnam as a whole. Hello, it's a pleasure to have you here with Talk Vietnam.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Yes, this is your first time on Talk Vietnam.
It is.
So how are you feeling?
I'm feeling well, thank you.
Let me begin our program with my first question. What brought you here to Vietnam in the very first place?
Well, I first came out to Asia in 1989 to take up appointment as Chief Executive of Hong Kong Arts Centre. And my first holiday after arriving in Hong Kong was to Vietnam in 1990. So I came on a fly drive holiday with Cathay Pacific, and it was a pretty amazing experience. I really enjoyed the country. I found the people really warm and friendly, and I wanted to come back. So the following year, a colleague and I set up a kind of joint venture to do a mapping exercise of the arts sector in Vietnam. And also we gathered information about Vietnamese artists to take back to Hong Kong to set up exchanges between Hong Kong and Vietnam.
Then what made you decide to choose Vietnam for your retirement?
Well, I kept coming back to Vietnam, and I'd actually met my wife, who's a ballet dancer, while I was working with UNESCO, and her ballet company, Đoàn Ballet Thang Mười from Saigon, was touring Thailand. So we married. My last job was with the British Council. So I'm an Asian culture, history person. And so it wouldn't have made much sense for me to stay in Cambridge, where we were living at the time. The only reason we really went back was to see my father in his last years, and also to give my daughter, who was born in Hanoi, a chance to live in the UK for a few years. But we decided we wanted her to live for a longer period in Vietnam, so we came back in 2010.
Mm-hmm. So since 2010 until now, you both had the experience of living in Hanoi and then Ho Chi Minh City.
Yeah.
What brought you to Ho Chi Minh City?
Well, it's my wife's hometown, so it makes much more sense because all her family are here. And also, when I came back, I wasn't sure about it because I really love Hanoi. But obviously, it makes sense to base ourselves here because my wife's family is here. And when I came back, I decided I was going to really immerse myself in the history and culture of the town to try and understand it better, which is what I focused on.
Before COVID, you conducted tours, right? Heritage tours for foreign visitors. So how was that before COVID, and how did COVID affect, the tours?
Well, I started out doing tours many years ago, and I was finding myself really busy. So in the end, I whittled it down to working with one company from Hanoi, and we dealt with kind of VIP American tourists, groups of up to about 30. And I would do them maybe once a month or something like that, which allowed me more time to do research. In some ways, I miss that. The tours haven't really restarted because, as you know, the tourism sector was very badly hit during COVID, and it hasn't thoroughly recovered yet. I think perhaps it'll be a few years before it's completely back to normal. I used to enjoy doing these tours. One of the things I found was that, particularly with American tourists, there was much interest in the history surrounding the war. And people were very surprised to know that Vietnam has a long history stretching back thousands of years. So there's much more to Vietnam than just the American war period.
Right.
Apart from stunning tourist attractions such as the Saigon Notre Dame Cathedral, Chợ Lớn, and the Central Post Office, Ho Chi Minh City has many other historical landmarks that captivate international tourists and cement the city's reputation as a heritage tourism center. When Tim Doling guides tourists around the city, his wish is that they behold, experience, and hear the lesser-known stories about these sites. As a tour guide, he shares a wealth of fascinating information that charms many visitors.
Go to the other side.
It's partly for my work because I work in heritage in New Zealand. So that's really important to understand that these markers, they're living buildings. They represent the culture of people, of ancestors that have come through and they've survived colonization. And that's really, really important.
This was the American legation.
Thanks to his vivid narration and dedication, Tim Doling has enthralled legions of overseas visitors with insights they would never have otherwise learn about the city.
With the gates here, called the refinery. This is the Grand Canal, the last bit of it just before it was filled in the 1880s. And this is where we are now. This area here, as I say, it became a boulevard in the late 1860s. In 1885, the first railway line was built in the whole of Indochina from Saigon to My Tho. And the first railway station was right here. And it ran all the way down the boulevard.
It's interesting how he is merging the architecture with the economy, with life, and how that develops, and the French influence, the Chinese influence, all of that kind of piece. I like the architectural piece of it.
Due to his ongoing love and passion for the city's culture and history, Tim Doling has grown increasingly attached to Ho Chi Minh City. Furthermore, he inspires many people working in the architecture and culture sectors to join him in preserving and sharing memories of Vietnam then and now.
One of the activities that I best enjoyed was taking the walking tours with him while he was writing this book. He piqued my interest also in the historical architecture, particularly the French colonial architecture, as well as the indigenous buildings that were first built here, and like the oldest house in the city, right?
You are also a strong advocate for the preservation of Ho Chi Minh City's historic buildings. Talking about these, what can you say about the experiences of other countries, like lesson learned from other countries?
Well, when we criticize the destruction of heritage, I think it's not meant in any nasty way. It's simply to say every other country has gone through exactly the same, and we've eventually come to the conclusion that it's not a good process. So, for example, after Britain recovered from the Second World War, there was a major phase of development, and a huge amount of heritage was lost. And so we see this happening again and again. In Vietnam's case, because you had this 30 years of war, and then you have economic sanctions for another 15, 20 years. So the kind of development phase comes much later. So it just so happens that it's happening now rather than it was happening with us in the 60s, 70s, whatever. One very instructive comparison is Singapore, because Singapore is an Asian country, and in the 60s and 70s under Lee Kuan Yew, there was a huge development campaign. A lot of heritage was destroyed, and the government commissioned a report in 1984, it's called the Wong Report, and it concluded that one of the major reasons for the decline in tourist numbers was the fact that so much heritage had been destroyed. And also there was great criticism from local people they talked to that the city, that the place where they were brought up, the place they knew as home, had just vanished. It had changed completely. So they no longer felt a sense of identity and belonging as they had when they were young. And as a result of this, this had a fairly major impact on policy in Singapore. They set up the National Heritage Board. And since that time, they've done their best to preserve as many buildings that are still left as possible. And heritage is now a major feature of their tourism drive.
Right. So do you think that Vietnam can learn from that lesson? And is it now the time for the tourism sector in Vietnam to really think about their long-term strategy?
Yeah, I certainly think so. I mean, there are other economic arguments for development and promotion and preservation of heritage, but I think because the role of the property sector here and people are out to make money as quickly as possible, talking about longer-term economic developments is not really going to cut it. So really you've got to look at an area which is very important to Vietnam, and that is, of course, is tourism. So with Ho Chi Minh City particularly, I think the average stay here is about 2.6 days or something like that. I mean, it could be much, much longer if a concerted effort was made to develop existing heritage and create kind of heritage trails.
Today, Talk Vietnam will follow Tim Doling to visit somewhere in Ho Chi Minh City that bears all this architectural style's historical and architectural hallmark.
Definitely. A lot of people come and see this building, thankfully, because it's one of the most famous tourist destinations here. The sad thing is that most people who come here are told that this is a work by Gustave Eiffel, who is famous for the tower in Paris. It was built between 1886 and 1891, and it's a work by Marie-Alfred Foulou. Now, Foulou actually was responsible for something like 7 or 8 different structures in Saigon, and at least 4 of them still exist today.
Right. So why was there such a misunderstanding and misinformation about?
Well, when we look at the interior, you might understand how it could be confused for a work by Eiffel, because it's got a sort of an arched framework of cast iron, and it's all exposed. So it looks like a piece of Eiffel's ironwork, because it's not just a splendid work of art. It also conveys a message about progress in telecommunications.
How does that message transfer to people through the architect?
For example, the patron god of all the post office system in Indochina during the French period was the god Hermes, and you can see the head of the god up there, kind of overlooking all activities. He's the sort of herald god in Greek mythology who runs messages with his winged sandals between the gods and the normal people. And there was another statue inside of the goddess Iris, who's his female equivalent, also a messenger god. That sadly has gone, but Hermes' face still exists today. Also, when we look at the front of the building, you can see there are plaques over all of the windows here, and they carry the names of famous scientists and philosophers and thinkers who were responsible for the progress in power, electronics, and particularly telecommunications. And Foulou did this purposely because he wanted to give the idea of progress, technological, scientific progress, particularly through telecommunications, in a time of modern development. So the same message is coming through even today.
Thank you so much for sharing. Because I don't have that understanding, and usually I pass by and just the visual of the building, deep history behind it. And thanks to our conversation today, I learned a lot.
Tim Doling has researched the 1950s to 1970s era modernist architecture of Saigon. In so doing, he quickly realized that the southern region is a lively museum that embodies the characteristics of this iconic architectural style.
In your opinion, what are the most protected or preserved historical sites here in Ho Chi Minh City?
Well, those which it's become apparent are of attractions to tourists. So, for example, we have the post office is one. The Independence Palace, which is a model site in terms of the way in which its interpretation has been developed over the last 10 years or so. It's a superb example of a museum and a heritage site rolled into one. So those two are very well preserved. But of course, there's a lot of other potential buildings which could equally be important. For example, the Wibanyanzan, the Town Hall, the People's Committee building, the murals in the main hall, and the beautiful decoration of the interior. It would be a splendid site for tourists to see. Yet another, I mean, there are many more examples like that which we could think of to put together a tourist trail.
Right. It could be iconic historical buildings or something hidden in deep down in the alley, like the temple that you took me to. So this is a long question. Usually depicted as the country's dynamic economic powerhouse, Ho Chi Minh City is rarely considered as a cultural center in its own right. But if you look hard enough, you can still find what's left of the elegant architectural heritage, which once won the city title Pearl of the Orient. So is that the reason why your book, Exploring Saigon Chợ Lớn, seeks to identify that heritage and introduce it through a series of walking tours before COVID?
Basically, that's what I was trying to do. These various chapters full of guided tours are there to take people to the areas where there is potential for interest. So just standing next to the National Bank or something like that, there's lots of stories created around that bank. Further down, there's the Eiffel Bridge, one of the oldest structures in Vietnam and the only surviving Eiffel structure in Vietnam, of great interest to tourists, but as yet, very few tour itineraries actually included. I don't think any do, actually. It's very popular with weddings, though.
Well, I believe that every space, every place has its own history. And if we look hard enough, it is a cultural place.
It is indeed.
Tim's best-known book is Exploring Saigon Chợ Lớn, Vanishing Heritage of Ho Chi Minh City, which was published in 2019. It recounts the growth and flourishing of Saigon and its sister city, Chợ Lớn, from the 17th century to the present day. It incorporates 21 self-guided tours of the southern metropolis and neighboring areas such as Hoc Mon, Bien Hoa, and Cần Giờ. The book also examines the destruction of the built heritage in recent years and suggests how this issue might be tackled.
Obviously, different people have different taste and preferences. But speaking of the tourists that you have met and interacted with, usually what are they interested in? They want to experience, let's say, the Cu Chi Tunnel, for example.
It depends what kind of group you're talking to. I mean, the people going to Cu Chi are very mixed. I mean, you get the sort of upmarket cultural tourists, and you get just general people who are coming here for a beach holiday and maybe stop off overnight here and do a trip to Cu Chi. So it's very mixed. I mean, the people I was talking to were the kind of people who would want to go into great detail. In fact, several people asked if I did tours of the secret tunnels around Saigon. It's very difficult to get into them. There are about 4 or 5 around the city, and some of them are absolutely fascinating. You go into a room and you open a wardrobe and you climb down a hole, and then you go down another tunnel, and eventually you come to an underground printing cellar. And there's several places like that in the city, but sadly they're not open to visitors, and it's quite difficult to organize trips. But there'd be an enormous market, very specialized, because you couldn't take too many people in. But the kind of people who would go to this would pay a lot of money. But the thing is, if you did a tour for those people, they could be charged large amounts of money. So
yeah, and usually you can measure. I mean, you can foresee or make a guess of the preference of your group of tourists, right? Because you know their background and where they're from, and maybe what topics they are interested in, so you can design the tours accordingly. Your 500-page book exploring Quảng Nam, Hội An, Mỹ Sơn, Đà Nẵng, and Tam Kỳ was published in 2020 as an effort to stimulate demand for tourism in Guang Nam and Da Nang months after COVID-19 pandemic. And can you explain more about this?
I should say from the outset that I think the Hoi An authorities, the Preservation Centre, is doing a tremendous job with the zoning and classification of its 1,250-something relics. I mean, it's an enormous task. And they're doing extremely well. But Hoi An, like many other parts of the world, with the advent of cheap package tours, is suffering from, or certainly was before COVID, I think it's probably about to start again, is suffering from over-tourism. And so one of the things that struck me when I did this book was I was trying to sort of move people out spatially through providing more information about places they could visit outside in rural Guang Nam, rural Da Nang, and even as far south as Tam Kỳ.
Tim's most recent guidebook is Exploring Guang Nam, published in 2020. It details the long history of this important region. The book traces the development of Hoi An and later Da Nang as international trading ports, the emergence of the Nguyen Dynasty palace fortress of Thanh Chiêm, modern Viet Nam as the cradle of the Romanized Vietnamese script, or Quốc ngữ, the growth of Tam Kỳ during the colonial period, and the strategic importance of Guang Nam Da Nang during the resistance war against America period. Exploring Guang Nam offers 15 self-guided tours to Hoi An, Da Nang, Mỹ Sơn, Cù Lao Chàm, and Tam Kỳ.
You also published the book Exploring Huế. Can you enlighten us with some narratives about the Nguyen dynasties and its extraordinary architecture?
Well, where do I start? I spent a lot of pages describing it. There's all sorts of architecture you can see there. Obviously, the royal architecture, the palaces with the beautiful twin houses, big palaces, kind of up to 11, 12 compartments across, and several houses deep. Extraordinary architecture, which I think can't be matched anywhere else in the country. And then, of course, you have the tombs, which have various different styles. I spent a lot of time in my book offering people the opportunity to be Indiana Jones and go and find the tombs of the Nguyen lords, which are very hidden in remote areas, although I did provide the GPS location. But you can spend a lot of time doing that, or you can go to the big famous tombs, which of course are different styles of architecture, each one. My particular favorite, I think, in Hue is the architecture of the Phu, or Dae, the princely residence. I've got a number of favorites. The Phu, Thuy Lý Vern, is one of my favorites in the eastern part of the city. It's a beautiful style of architecture, and it's based on the Nhà Rường, the traditional house of that region, but on a much grander scale. And there's always a big three-arch gate to access it, and behind it the beautifully decorated screen, Binh Phong.
Okay.
Yeah.
And why was the Hue citadel chosen 4 out of 9 times of selecting capitals throughout Nguyen dynasties?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Well, for one reason, I guess it was secure, because you have the sea up here and there's a long winding river. And we know from history that it was always dotted with fortresses, including one on the estuary. But not only that, the key reason was feng shui, or geomancy, because traditionally big structures like that, citadels, big houses, would always point southwards. And so the tradition was to make sure that it was protected from evil spirits coming from the south. And immediately to the south of that area is the Người, which is a mountain which protects. It's like a sort of natural screen which stops the evil spirits coming in.
Over the past few years, Tim Doling has channeled his love and much effort into publishing 3 tourist guidebooks on Vietnam aimed at independent travelers. The first book, Exploring Huế, was published in 2018. It introduces readers to Nguyễn dynasty history, affording an opportunity to understand and learn about the rich surviving built heritage. It also introduces the Chinese heritage of Bao Vinh, Địa Linh, and Gia Hội, the architecture of the French towns south of the river, relics of the American War era, and the cultural traditions of the region's ethnic groups. Readers can select from 23 different tours covering Huế City and Thừa Thiên Huế Province, 6 districts and 2 towns.
So in an effort to bring knowledge of Vietnamese history to more people, you established a heritage portal, and it's called Historic Vietnam, and also the Flickr page as well. Can you share more about this?
Yes, my Historic Vietnam portal was developed in around about 2014, I think, because I developed it into being a venue for material in French. So I translate, say, an article on a particular subject and then put that online. So, for example, Petrus Key's description of Saigon in the 1880s, I translated that into 3 sections and put it online in English, which I think is useful for the public. I also organize 4 different then and now Facebook groups, so we compare times gone by with modern times in the same location. So we show a beautiful old building and then a parking lot or something like that. It's not always as bad as that. And so I've created a Flickr site which brings together all of these then and now images from Saigon Chalern, Hanoi and the Red River Delta, Guang Nam, and also from Hue. There's some documentation as well, but largely photos, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that through photos, people would see the now and then, and that would make things much more livelier. Besides architecture, you also have a special passion for the history of railways and tramways of Vietnam. Why so?
Well, I think it's well known that British people are always a bit crazy about railways. So when I came to Vietnam the first time, I very much was interested in the railways here. And when I started learning about the history, I realized how important they were. Because you imagine how everything was localized in a country like Vietnam. The roads were quite poor. The French didn't really upgrade the roads terribly well at the start, but they had begun constructing railways. And by the 1930s, you see that it was possible for people in the south to move to the north in 42 hours and back again. So I have a theory that the railways actually made a major contribution towards the concept of nationality, help people to understand that they're part of a nation in a way which probably hasn't been documented. It certainly broke down localism. It made possible trading between areas further apart. And for example, would it have ever been possible for somebody in Hanoi to enjoy nước mắm from Phan Thiết before the railways? Probably not.
Right. And there was no airplane, but boat and ship, maybe?
No, well, boats. I mean, the other thing about the railways in Vietnam, they are special because they suffered 30 years of catastrophic destruction, followed by another 15, 20 years of stagnation because there was no money during the time when the country was sanctioned. And so it wasn't really till the 1990s that the development started to get going. So it's happened very late, and obviously this is of interest to someone like me because there's still a lot of old equipment being used, old equipment and rolling stock. So it's fascinating for me to see this process of upgrading the railway gradually, but still seeing parts of its original equipment from the French period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reunification train, I think it's sort of like a symbol or the pride of Vietnamese people.
Yes, I spent a lot of time in the 1990s traveling up and down on that. I remember in the 1990s arriving in the morning, going past Zapat, and always in Zapat there were steam locomotives in the siding. But they were withdrawn, I think, in 2002. So after that, there were no steam locomotives operating.
Tim Doling is currently working on a new history of the Vietnamese railway network, which will be an updated and expanded version of his 2012 book, The Railways and Tramways of Vietnam. It will recall the growth of Vietnam's mainline railway system, the urban tramways in Hanoi, Saigon, and Da Nang, and the various industrial and forestry branch lines during the French colonial and post-colonial periods. The crucial role of the railways during the First and Second Indochina Wars, the country's reconstruction after 1975, and the development of today's modern railway system.
So how would you describe a typical day of yours as a historian?
Well, my life goes from being very boring to very interesting. At the moment, I'm going through a boring stage because I'm staying at home most of the time just working, whereas when I do my research, that's what I really enjoy. So I basically make arrangements, go out, hire a car and a driver, and just get on with the research, and that's the fun part. But unfortunately, it's only a small amount, and then there's a lot of working away, examining sources, visiting the National Archives, and so on. And of course, typing on a computer. It's all boring, except the fun part when you go out and actually, the writing and the research is tedious. It's good when you finished it because you feel you've achieved something. But the fun part is going out and actually seeing things yourself.
Okay. I've read an article about you on L Decoration website, and it says, from your perspective as an observer, young people in Vietnam with a high level of education are increasingly interested in cultural heritage and national identity. So can you please give us some examples to illustrate?
Okay. Well, a few years ago, when I first came back in 2010 with my family, I felt there really wasn't much of a community of people, like-minded people who are interested to know why is this building being demolished and why are they not preserving that? And in fact, it was a very small group of expats and overseas Vietnamese who I got together with in 2014, and we set up the Facebook group Đài quan sát di sản, Saigon, the Heritage Observatory. And at that time, I think it was perceived as maybe an expatriate group. A few years ago, we made the decision of the entire admin of Saigon Heritage Observatory resigned, and we basically recruited lots of new young people in as administrators. And now it's much more of a local group than it was. And I think that's a good thing. But not only that, the encouraging thing is there are lots of new groups being set up to encourage appreciation of built heritage, for example. Every week there are tours now. I see a colleague, Candy Nguyen, who's been organizing a series of trips to Chalan, and recently looking at all the old tombs in the Phu Nhuận area, which is something I never thought that local people would be interested in. But there's an organization called Tan Man Kiến Trúc, which is doing an amazing job producing documentation on different architectural styles, ranging from looking at the decorative styles of colonial buildings to examining the particular characteristics of the Nhà Rường or other types of local architecture. So it's much more prevalent now. And going back to this question of restoring buildings and regenerating areas, what we see nowadays is a lot of old buildings are being taken over by young, predominantly young entrepreneurs and renovated, and you see new cafes and boutiques, and they're always packed, and it's a predominantly young audience. So there's obviously a growing local interest in the preservation of heritage as an aspect of perpetuating Vietnamese heritage.
Talk Vietnam tagged along with Tim Doling to visit a special location in Co Giang Phu Nhuận district, Ho Chi Minh City. That is the tomb of the Nguyen dynasty's general, Võ Di Nguy.
Very famous naval commander. And I wanted to bring you to this because, first of all, it's a national monument. It was registered in 1993. And secondly, because this particular individual played a very big part in Vietnamese history. So he was the one who really assisted the Nguyen dynasty to take control of the country and create their series of emperors from Gia Long in 1802 to Bao Dai in the 1930s.
The mausoleum is divided into two parts. At the front is the general's temple, and at the back is this tomb. Even though over 200 years have passed, his mausoleum retains a majestic and solemn facade, representing the stature of this revered official. In addition, the monument also reflects the southern art of ancient mausoleum construction.
The whole tomb was constructed with a special type of plaster, which I think was called which was made with various tree saps and things, so it's disintegrated over time. And so when it's been upgraded, it's been repaired with concrete, and that in turn has crumbled. So you can just about see the beauty of it. For example, on the Bing Fong screen, which serves to prevent evil spirits coming into the tomb area. And it's still, you can just about make out the animals, I think they're deer, on the back.
And this is very special animal over there.
Yeah, this is the Asian short-clawed otter, which is an interesting addition to many Nguyen dynasty tombs of the late 18th, early 19th century. And the reason is there's a story that while Nguyen Phuc An, who later became Emperor Gia Long, was still escaping from the Tay Son, there was a Tay Son army chasing after him. And somehow the otters, by removing his tracks or something, or he followed the otters, there's various stories. You're not quite sure which one to believe, but the otters are supposed to have played a major part in actually helping him escape. So this is why otters have an important place on many of the tomb decorations today. 4 sacred animals, dragon, unicorn, phoenix, and tortoise. You can see deer, you can see tigers. There's all sorts of animals and symbolic representation throughout the tomb.
As a historian and who has a deep knowledge of Vietnamese history, what do you think about the teaching and learning and awareness of Vietnamese people about history, and what else should be done to improve?
Well, I'm not really fully aware of what the history syllabus contains, but I've never seen any detailed history books which contain the kind of comprehensive information. My daughter's experience was of doing history at school. She studied at a Vietnamese school as well as an international school, was that the history taught tended to be a little bit more related to battles and revolution, whereas it probably would be good to be more comprehensive, covering all aspects of Vietnamese history. But as I say, I haven't actually seen the syllabus, so I'm not really aware. It would be nice to think that the kind of information I've been researching would be the kind of information that is taught. Many of the tour guides now are researching their own information and finding out about specific places, specific happenings in history, particular buildings and so on. So they're doing their own research to make up for the fact that perhaps they didn't learn about that at school.
So what keeps you staying in Vietnam throughout all those years?
Obviously, we came back in 2010 because my specialist area of work is on Asia and particularly Vietnam. So it makes sense for me to be here. I love the country. I'm very happy living here. It's my wife's home. It's my daughter's home. She's Vietnamese. Oh, I'm just very happy here. And I think also as you get older, you want to keep active, you know. If you can't always do lots of research trips, so you can at least keep your brain active. So researching, I think, is a good exercise to stay mentally alert. You know?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your insightful sharing about the history of Ho Chi Minh City and of Vietnam in general. And I hope that with more awareness of how much history and how much cultural values that we can take advantage of, the tourism, the domestic tourism can thrive in the near future.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
And that's it for Talk Vietnam. We'll see you again in our next episode.